So the balance between the kick and the sub bass is quite good. Let's have a little listen to these mid basses that will probably need quite a bit of attention. Let's start with the deep bass in this section. So we can see with something like this, there's zero headroom here, again for it being kind of normalised. Doesn't look like there's too much clipping as a byproduct of that. It's quite an aggressive sort of sound. It's relatively squarey in its waveform. So we'll just, in fact I might do this for all of these at the mo. Just highlight all three of those tracks and go -9 dB to give us a bit of headroom for processing. Because I might do a bit of distortion. I'll probably do some subtractive EQing that will get rid of a lot of the energy. So I might not need to actually have 9 dB worth of headroom, but it doesn't hurt at this stage. And given that the faders are so low, or set so low at the moment anyway, I can certainly make up 9 dB. I've got sort of a good 20 dB of resolution on this fader left if I really need to crank it, but that's probably not going to be the case. So let's have a listen to this again. So you can see there's a lot of really subby stuff in there anyway, and then some more kind of character stuff from that kind of slightly filtered kind of square wave sort of vibe. So I'm going to put in a high pass filter. I'm going to take it down to about 12 dB per octave at around 100. So I want to keep this section here in there, but a lot of the sub is kind of taken care of, so I don't really need any of that stuff at all there, even though it's quite powerful sounding. But with that sub in the mix as well, having both of them in there just kind of messes up the sound really. It doesn't really help. It gets too muddy, too confused, and it's not really kind of tight enough. So I'm going to get rid of the sub on probably all of these tracks. And let's have a little listen and a little look. So yeah, it kind of curls off at about 2k. It starts dipping down a lot, and by sort of 6k we're kind of out there really. There is still some high frequencies, but they're really tailing off by that point. So what I might do is put in my shaper box, put the kick back in for context, going to move that plug in and have that at the end of the chain. I'm going to add in some distortion here. Go to my waves, distortion, where is it? Distortion, saturation, harmonic exciters, and I'm going to go for the Infected Mushroom Pusher plugin, and I'm going to add in a bit of low stuff down here. Just checking with my PFL that even though I've put in that Infected Mushroom Pusher, I've still got some headroom in here, which I do at the moment. I'm going to add in another distortion plugin in between the sidechain compressor and that first distortion. I'm just going to add in the Logic Overdrive. Great plugin, this one. Create some extreme distortions there, and I'm going to look to nip out a few bits and bobs here, including also putting in 100 Hz my 12 dB per octave high pass filter, and that's because by adding in distortion and using harmonic exciters and stuff like this, it kind of adds back in some of the bass that we've got rid of. So it's quite useful to add in, if you're doing anything where you're doing any kind of frequency bracketing or doing some EQ moves to avoid masking, then it's generally a good idea to put that same EQ at the start of your chain and towards the end of it, in between these processors that will add frequencies and add harmonic content in both directions. We're not just creating overtones, we're kind of essentially creating undertones as well. We're creating distortions going both ends of the frequencies that are coming through here. Probably going to nip some of this stuff by, that's above 4K as well, and I'm going to do some sort of booster cut EQ to get rid of some of the mud that I've introduced with the extreme distortion. Okay, it's not sounding amazing at the moment, but let's see. It's going to be a layer as part of 3 or 4 different textures on here. So let's have a listen to the next layer and see how that works with the sub. I'll get rid of the kick for now. So straight away we can hear that that's a much wider, a much more stereo sounding part of the bass layer. I'm going to get rid of that 12 dB per octave, low end everything below 100. It's taken care of by the sub. But let's have a little listen and a little look to some of the other frequencies that are kind of in this mid-range here, this kind of 1 to 3K part. It's got some interesting low mid stuff in here. Some of which I'm going to get rid of. And I think I'm going to use a shelving EQ, probably on a higher end plugin. Let's go for the vintage EQ collection. Let's go for the console, and let's have a little go at adding in some top end with this. So a couple of dB at the highs there. In fact, I'm going to put that in front of this channel EQ because I'm also, although I want the shelving EQ, I also want to get rid of some of the extreme highs as well. So I'm kind of using the channel EQ for my sort of subtractive EQ to do stuff that's taking things away. But when I want to add something, when I want to add something to the sound, I'm using a kind of higher end EQ, something that's modelled on vintage hardware, because it will actually have character within the sound of the plugin itself, rather than the kind of relatively dull sounding digital EQs. So let's have a listen to that with the deep bass and the kick as well. And then I'll put on the sidechain compression for that new layer. Go back to that deep bass layer and maybe pull back some of that overdrive now, because some of those mids, those harsh mids, that it's kind of froggy sounding mids, are a little bit too much with this grit bass in there as well. And what I might do as well is change this vintage console EQ to be working in dual mono. And what I can do here is, rather than get it to work on the left and right channel independently, I can change it to mid-side mode. So the middle I'm going to leave alone and put that back to 0 dB, and the sides I'm going to have boosted by 2.5 dB. So I'm going to add a bit of width with this EQ because I'm only EQing the wider part of the stereo signal. I'm kind of leaving the stuff in the middle alone. In fact, in that middle section, I'm also going to use, let's just click that at 60 Hz. I'm also going to get rid of all the extreme lows so it can just be taken care of by that sub channel. Let's see how this sounds. With this bass layer as well, I'm just going to completely solo it for a section. It's useful to work on this in the context of the other bass layers, but I also want to have a look at this just in isolation, as I think it probably could do with a tiny bit of compression. Even though the waveforms look pretty solid and consistent, you can hear that the tone kind of changes a touch throughout the notes. So let's add in a compressor. I'm going to go for a relatively high ratio, 4:1. I'm going to give it 80 milliseconds attack, 160 release at this sort of tempo. I'm just going to pull down, actually before I pull down the threshold, I'm also going to put the sidechain detection circuit, which is actually the internal sidechain detection circuit rather than using a keyed input. I'm going to just have that changed to, rather than its peak or its maximum amplitude, have it done on an average. So I'm just compressing the RMS of this. I'm just getting that to be slightly more consistent before it gets pumped with that shaper box. So that feels a bit better to me there. Slightly more consistent with that level. I'm not going to worry about the makeup gain too much again because this is so low here. I could actually do with some extra fader resolution when I'm mixing all the way down here. So definitely no makeup gain. It's already got some built in through the soft clipper. It's going to add level to it, but I'm quite happy for this to not have any makeup gain here. Now with that pumping along, let's hear that with the sub bass and the kick. starts sounding a bit better. But on this track I might also want to add in some modulation, and let's put in a scan of vibrato, and let's see, we'll have different rates for the left and right, and we'll try and make this feel really stereo, this sound. And I'm going to actually add in a BX saturator. So in the last video, or the drums video, I did a similar technique where I made everything below a certain frequency mono. I'm going to do the same thing with this plugin, but I'm also got some mid-side level controls here, and some kind of distortion controls that are again frequency dependent, both for the middle section and for the high section as well. So this is a really, really good mixing plugin. So let's have a look at what the EQ is on here. And again, I think I want everything below around 400 Hertz to be summed to mono. So that everything in the center kind of feels a little bit more solid at the really kind of low parts of this signal. And then if I solo the wides, that's essentially the stereo info. If I can make the signal more mono, it's kind of default stereo level, or I can increase that stereo width as well, by just turning up the stereo sides a touch. And then everything above where I am here, which is maybe about a K, something like that. Just going to overdrive those a touch. Everything that's low and that's in the middle, everything that's below kind of 250, 300 Hertz. Add a bit of power to that as well. So here's the sound without it. Here's the sound with the plugin on. So it probably doesn't feel quite as powerful on its own, but in the context, it should work better. With the kick and the rest of that drum. So let's put the full loop in actually, full drum set. too bad at the moment. Let's have a listen to this next textured layer. Again, you can see it's quite a stereo bass here, so we'll do the summing to mono trick for everything below kind of 300, 400 hertz. We're going to remove everything below 100 hertz anyway. Might come a bit higher with that actually. Some of this stuff that's the more interesting part of this sound. All that kind of glitchy stuff. And again, I'm going to put that summing to mono BX saturator on there. That mid-grip bass is still sounding a tiny bit too bright here. I might just undo some of the saturation I've done at the top side, and I might take that stereo side down. Just have a dB of width there. Let's see how that sounds. That's working quite nicely as a unit for those three now. So what I might also do is put a bit of glue compression at the bus level, and then put the sidechain, auto sidechain compression in there again. So I'm going to go for my third-party compressor in this case, and I'm going to go for the glue again. It's a nice, interesting plugin here. And I'm going to include the sidechain mode up to about 80 hertz. There shouldn't really be much below that anyway, but in case there is, I don't want it being triggered. It should be a different part of the frequency spectrum here. So it's tightening it up a tiny bit, and let's put it in the shaper box. Let's have the sub back in. And the full drum mix. That's not sounding too bad. What I might want to do is just for these, certainly these top layers here, is add in a little bit of bass reverb, which is just going to be for the top end of the bass. So again, it's going to be a kind of localized reverb. So I'm going to have bass verb, going to make that pink. Going to press Control and T to put it here in the mixer. We can see that the input is bus 13. The output here is stereo output. I actually want that going into this mid-bass submix because I don't really want it some with the sub at the mo. I am going to make a full kind of bass submix as well, but for the moment that's going to go. In fact, actually, yeah, let's do that straight away. So let's have that going to bus 14. Let's have this mid-bass submix going out to bus 14 as well, and the sub bass going to bus 14, and then that itself can go back to the submaster, as I think the drum submix should do. So let's put that there as well. So I've got this bass verb going into the bass stem, and let's do the same thing here. I can make it purple this time, dark purple, because it's an output track. That then should stand at the bottom of that there. Bass stem should go out to submaster. Otherwise it's just going to route the input to the output, sort of route it to itself. Some odd things going on there, but let's add in channel EQ. Again, I'm going to go for third party reverb. I might go for vintage verb in this instance. I'm going to make the reverb much shorter. Just have a couple of seconds. A reverb, I just want it to be a kind of bright reverb at the start of the sound, and I'm going to remove all of the low end. So I only want kind of mid-range and above. Anything above a K can kind of go through. I change that up to be 24 dB per octave, so it's quite a steep slope, so that we're really only hearing the high frequencies of these bass tracks. Might mute the sub and just listen to the stems for the mo. I'm going to add in that textured bass. Also going to turn off the drum submix for this. So what I might do on this bass verb auxiliary as well is add in some compression after the fact for that bass reverb channel. And again, I'm going to just want to bring up the tails a touch. I'm going to change it to RMS mode. Now that bass reverb's way too loud at the moment, but I've had to crank up the input gain a touch because the level of the reverb here is so low for the threshold for it to be compressed in the first place. I might use the output gain to kind of undo that +8 there. but it depends how much fader resolution we've got here with the signal. I might leave that there and then use the fader to bring it down rather than the other way around. I'm going to add in the sidechain shaper box compressor as well, so that the tails of that all pump in time along with the kick and the rest of the bass lines. It just adds a little bit of character, a little bit of width to the signal, without kind of muddying up or confusing the stereo image too much at the low end. It's not really causing any major issues or major problems. One thing I will do actually on this mid bus as well, even though I've done it on a couple of the individual tracks, I can do it before the shaper box, because I'm not really going to do any saturation. I'm really just going to use this summing to mono aspect and go everything below maybe 350 hertz is sum to mono at mid bass bus level. So that when we look at the frequency analysis, let's just turn that so the decay goes much slower. So now that I've got those there, we can kind of see that there's no deviation in that second signal. We can see that there's a red and a white line together that starts to diverge above 350 odd hertz or 300 hertz. So we start to see some stereo width coming in here at the higher parts of the bass line, but everything below that, it's a singular line that curves through here, meaning that everything's going to be in mono, so everything's going to be really tight with the kick and tight with the low end. So even though that bass reverb is relatively subtle, it does make a little difference to the texture when you get rid of it, and it helps kind of fill out some of those spaces, and helps kind of oddly glue some of those mid-bass sounds together, along with this kind of whole stem that includes the sub-basses and the mid-basses together. I'm probably going to keep the acid basses out of this, because I'm going to do something much more different with that bass stem, but I might route the output of that submix into the bass stem later. We'll just kind of see how that goes when we get to the drop section in a little while.